The beginning of today's story is not a typical situation. It's a moment that compels all of us to rethink the assumptions we place on others. The silence inside the airplane cabin, where everyone was preparing for what should have been a routine flight, was soon shattered by an unforeseen act. This is the story of the Williams family, a completely innocent family, thrust into a wrongful situation because of a simple misunderstanding. It was a normal morning at Houston Intercontinental Airport. The loudspeaker announcements echoed across the terminal, the sound of rolling suitcases brushed the tiled floor, and the hurried glances of passengers formed the soundtrack of a bustling world. However, in the first-class cabin of the plane preparing for takeoff, something unexpected was quietly brewing, a moment that would not only alter the lives of one family, but would become unforgettable to everyone aboard. Today's story begins with an ordinary family. Marcus and Sarah Williams, along with their 3-year-old son, boarded the plane, carrying with them the light-hearted anticipation of an exciting trip. They had waited a long time for this, a vacation carefully planned months. With the cheerful face of a father and the subtle anxiety of a mother, they quietly stepped through the first-class doorway, a place many dream of but few experience. They didn't boast, nor did they appear extraordinary. Just a small family, searching for peaceful moments in life, hoping to spend meaningful time together on this flight. For the little boy, this was his very first time flying first class, and everything around him filled him with wonder. He sat by the window, eyes gleaming as he gazed at the clouds outside. Their journey was a symbol of simple dreams, but everything was about to change within minutes. The moment they entered the first-class cabin, they could sense that the air was different from previous flights. Passengers sat quietly, some with headphones in, others still glued to their phones. But one strange detail stood out. Everyone was glancing at the Williams family. Something felt off. An invisible tension began spreading in the air. An event was about to unfold that would turn the entire flight into a story people would remember for a long time. And then Lexi, the flight's lead attendant, appeared. Dressed in her crisply pressed uniform, Lexi's presence in the cabin was commanding, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of impatience. She walked down the aisle, a sharp contrast to the calm and composed demeanor of the Williams family. As she passed by, she couldn't help but glance at them, her gaze lingering just a little too long. The strange feeling in Lexi's eyes caught the attention of someone else in the cabin. Almost instantly, an unclear suspicion formed in her mind. There was something about this family that made her uneasy. She paused momentarily before continuing her duties, yet the feeling lingered. Something about them didn't seem normal. Perhaps it was a mistaken instinct, but Lexi couldn't shake it off. That moment of doubt would soon lead to a decision that could not be undone. Really? As Marcus gently placed his son's backpack under the seat in front of them, a seemingly insignificant detail caught Lexi's eye, but to her it was crucial. Although none of the passengers or crew noticed, Lexi felt a slight jolt inside, a feeling that something wasn't right. That sense of discomfort slowly turned into suspicion. In less than 30 seconds, everything changed. Lexi stopped right beside the family, stood firmly, and looked directly at Marcus. Then she spoke a sentence no one expected. "Excuse me, sir, did you take something that doesn't belong to you?" That was the moment everyone would remember. The very first moment an innocent person was accused. The entire cabin fell into silence. Like a small explosion in a quiet room, every passenger's eyes locked onto the Williams family. Unspoken questions hung in the air. Why them? Why is a family simply preparing for a peaceful vacation? Everything suddenly became tense. All eyes were on them, people who had done nothing wrong. Marcus and Sarah looked at each other confused, not understanding why they were being accused. Sarah clutched her son tighter, trying to remain calm. The little boy looked up at his mother, his innocent eyes filled with worry. If you believe this is a misunderstanding, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to hit like if stories like this move you. This isn't just a story about a misunderstanding. It's about how bias and assumptions can derail the fate of a family, a community, and even an entire industry. The more we listen, the more we realize that not everything we see is the truth. But this story will open a deeper perspective into the flaws in how we perceive and judge one another. And now, let's continue to see whether the Williams family can hold on to their belief in justice, and whether Lexi will recognize the grave mistake she's made before it's too late. The heavy atmosphere refused to leave the cabin, and Lexi's question hung in the silence like a ticking bomb about to explode. The Williams family now found themselves at the eye of the storm, not understanding why they had been cornered in such a way. To everyone witnessing it, this was no longer a simple situation. It had become a test of dignity, honor, and justice. The passengers' attention began to shift. Some kept their eyes glued to their phones, but a large portion had stopped whatever they were doing. Everyone was now closely watching what would happen next. The glances held a mix of curiosity, surprise, and even unease. Murmurs broke out. A few people whispered while others silently shook their heads. The atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was filled with speculation. Marcus and his wife could only look at each other, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Sarah, I don't understand what's going on," Marcus murmured, his voice filled with frustration and fatigue. What they didn't realize was that Marcus's simple act, placing his son's backpack under the seat, was the very thing Lexi found suspicious. An utterly normal action, but in Lexi's eyes it was a sign of wrongdoing. She stared at them with an expression of firm conviction, as though nothing could change her mind. And then the tension escalated when Lexi requested to search the backpack. "May I check this, please?" Lexi said, her voice cold and firm. She did not explain, just a command. Marcus frowned, the confusion and anger beginning to swell inside him. "Of course," he replied, though his tone betrayed his disappointment. Sarah became even more tense, her palms beginning to sweat while their little boy still didn't understand what was happening. He only knew his mother was holding him tighter than usual. A long silence followed, and everything unfolded like a scene in slow motion. Lexi began to rummage through the backpack. Every item was taken out carefully and deliberately. A pair of headphones, an empty snack wrapper, and a book. Each item only heightened the tension in the cabin. No one spoke, but every passenger watched Lexi and the Williams family closely. The sense of unease in the air made everyone more alert than ever. While Lexi continued her search, Marcus held Sarah's hand tightly, his eyes never leaving Lexi's movements. He tried to stay composed, even though the anger rising inside him was overwhelming. "I didn't take anything from anyone," he said again. His lips pressed tightly together, determined not to let his restraint crack. Everyone in the cabin could hear the exhaustion in his voice, but no one dared to speak. This was unprecedented. People feared that speaking up might only make things worse. The tension peaked when Lexi found nothing inside the backpack. She sighed, her expression shifting slightly, a flicker of doubt flashing across her face. "There's no wallet in here," she muttered, but her voice didn't sound remorseful. Instead, the pride in her eyes remained unchanged. Marcus let out a quiet breath of relief, but the shame still clung to him. "We already told you," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Thank you, but we didn't take anything." But the ordeal wasn't over, and Lexi didn't stop. She scanned the cabin, her eyes sweeping across the passengers. A heavy silence blanketed the first-class cabin. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, as if they too were beginning to question whether this had all been a misunderstanding, whether Lexi's actions had crossed a line. The atmosphere thickened again as Lexi decided to seek confirmation from the other passengers. "Can anyone provide information about the missing wallet?" Lexi asked, her tone now firm and commanding. Passengers exchanged silent looks. No one spoke. A few shook their heads. Others simply sighed. Still, no one spoke up. A man a few rows back shook his head and quietly muttered, "She's making a mess out of this." That was when a voice rose from the back, breaking the silence. "Maybe you should double-check your facts before you start accusing people." An older woman spoke up, her voice sharp and full of criticism. The cabin suddenly felt like it had woken up. Every eye turned to her. Lexi froze, surprise flickering in her eyes. Not everyone agreed with her actions. This story is only just beginning, and what follows will be beyond anything any of them could have expected. Will Lexi accept the truth, that she was wrong? And will the Williams family be able to preserve their dignity and composure through this humiliating ordeal? If you believe Lexi's actions were wrong, leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to hit like to keep following this gripping story. As we delve deeper into this story, we realize that sometimes the assumptions we make about others can lead to consequences far more serious than we ever imagined. The first-class cabin remained steeped in tension, even as the passengers began murmuring after the recent incident. Everything seemed to fall into absolute silence, broken only by the sighs of those seated nearby. All eyes were still fixed on the Williams family, particularly Marcus and Sarah. Their expressions no longer reflected confusion or bewilderment. Now it was disappointment, shame, the crushing sense of being judged, looked down upon in front of everyone. A heavy silence wrapped around Marcus. He sat upright, his hands clenched tightly on his thighs. His entire body was tense like a balloon about to burst. Sarah, sitting beside him, gently held their trembling son in her arms. The boy kept looking at his mother, not understanding why everyone was staring at him and his parents with such doubt. Sarah glanced at her husband, her eyes full of worry. "You see?" she whispered, though her voice carried deep, aching disappointment. "We didn't do anything wrong. Why is this happening?" Marcus looked into her eyes, then slowly scanned the cabin. He could feel every stare, some pitying, others judging. Each one felt like a blade slicing into his heart. There's nothing more painful than being condemned for something you didn't do. The murmurs started to swell again, adding to the already suffocating atmosphere. But no one spoke up. It was as if they were all waiting for something, waiting to see what would happen next. Then an unexpected truth began to surface. After finding nothing in the backpack, Lexi stood still, her eyes never leaving the family. Though she said nothing, she could sense that things were not going the way she had assumed. And yet, no apology came from her lips. Instead, Lexi decided to search for answers among the other passengers. "Excuse me," she spoke up again, this time her voice less composed than before. "I need to verify once more. Has anyone seen this wallet go missing? Did anyone notice anything unusual?" The cabin turned deathly quiet. None of the surrounding passengers spoke. Silent glances passed back and forth like invisible waves rippling across the rows. Everyone seemed to be silently wondering, was Lexi right to keep pursuing something that may not even exist? Then a nearby elderly passenger rose from her seat, her voice cold and firm. "You should check around the galley area," she said assertively, without hesitation. "You might find what you're looking for there." Lexi paused, her expression suddenly shifting to one of uncertainty. She hadn't expected the woman's suggestion to hit her so squarely. But after a brief moment of hesitation, Lexi turned and walked briskly toward the galley, her grip tightening on the satchel she carried. She moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, seemingly eager to resolve the situation before it spiraled further out of control. Though no one said a word, the tension in the cabin grew heavier. Everyone tried to remain quiet, but their eyes followed the lead flight attendant. Every step Lexi took seemed to stretch time. Seconds felt like minutes. Some passengers began to fidget as if they no longer wanted to be involved in this growing spectacle. At the galley, Lexi began rummaging through everything. She opened storage compartments, pulled out service trays, and checked every corner. Her hands trembled slightly as doubt crept in. The anxiety only grew stronger. The passengers, still silent, continued to watch from afar. The air inside the plane was just as heavy as before, but now the attention had shifted. The stares were no longer focused on the Williams family. They were focused on Lexi, who had become the center of the storm. Another flight attendant, who had witnessed everything, seemed to lose patience. "What are you doing?" the other attendant asked, her tone barely masking her irritation. "Are you sure we need to keep going through all of this?" Lexi froze. The presence of her colleague only made her feel more cornered. She didn't respond, just shook her head and kept searching, the desperation now plain in her eyes. Moments later, her hand touched something strange. Without thinking, she pulled it out. A small black wallet, hastily hidden between two service trays. Lexi's face changed instantly. She looked down at the wallet in her hand. Her heart pounded. A bitter knot formed in her throat. She turned around, clutching the wallet, but one question rang loudly in her mind. "Have I been wrong all along?" When Lexi returned, wallet in hand, the Williams family said nothing. Marcus looked at her, no longer angry, just deeply disappointed. The pain of what had just happened was still clear in every part of his demeanor. "Whose wallet is this?" Lexi asked, her voice no longer firm. "You were wrong," Marcus replied, his voice tight with emotion. "We didn't do anything." And then, silence. Total silence engulfed the cabin once more. Everyone looked at one another, then at Lexi, the woman who had just caused a humiliating spectacle. The suffocating feeling returned. Only this time, it wasn't directed at the family. Now it surrounded Lexi. There were no words, only unanswered questions, cold glances from passengers, and the undeniable humiliation Lexi couldn't hide. This isn't over. The price of acting hastily and without proper judgment had just been paid. And everyone, Lexi, the passengers, and especially the Williams family, knew that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The first-class cabin remained cloaked in heavy silence. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Glances flickered between passengers, but no one made direct eye contact. Everyone could feel the tension creeping through the cabin like an invisible wave, sweeping away any sense of comfort that had once filled the space. The entire Williams family sat in silence. No one said a word. Marcus stared straight ahead, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, the pressure in his chest growing heavier with every passing second. The humiliation piled up, not just from being suspected, but from the sheer injustice of it all. Sarah stayed quiet beside him, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of their son who sat on her lap. The boy looked up at his mother, his eyes red from crying, sensing the unease in the air, though he didn't understand why. Something was looming, something waiting. Everything unfolded in quiet, slow motion, and the tension seemed unbearable. Lexi turned around, still holding the wallet she had found, but there was no relief on her face. Her hands trembled, and the confidence she once wore so easily now seemed lost. Lexi stopped in the middle of the cabin. Her gaze swept over the Williams family, then moved to the other passengers. Confusion clouded her expression. Every movement she made now lacked certainty, replaced by hesitation and lingering doubt she couldn't shake. The silence dragged on longer than anyone could have imagined. The passengers sat still, their eyes glinting like flickers of light in the dark. They could feel the injustice that had taken place, but no one knew how to undo it. Some looked upon the Williams family with empathy. Others struggled to understand how a flight attendant could act this way, with no restraint, no consideration. Lexi stood frozen in front of the Williams family, unable to speak. Being cornered is something no one can endure easily. And now it was Lexi who faced the consequences of her actions. She looked into Marcus's face. There was no longer anger in his eyes, only deep, overwhelming disappointment. It was a feeling Lexi had never known, the realization that she had not only hurt the Williams family, but herself as well. She had judged, she had been wounded, and she had done so based on assumptions and haste. Marcus could no longer remain seated. He rose from his seat, every step deliberate, steady, and strong, as if the silence had become too much to bear. "We have nothing more to explain," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "We did nothing wrong. You were wrong, and I don't know if you truly understand what you've done." Moments later, Sarah gently placed her hand on her husband's shoulder. She didn't speak, but her gaze said it all. They were standing firm. They would not allow this injustice to steal their dignity. Even in the face of humiliation, the family held their heads high. The tension surged. Lexi still stood there, the wallet clutched in her hand. A minute passed, then 2, then 3. Every second was like a dagger sinking deeper into her conscience. She couldn't walk away. She couldn't stay silent anymore. And in that moment, one emotion swallowed everything else. Regret. I'm sorry," Lexi finally whispered. Her voice no longer held authority. It wavered with shame and uncertainty. She looked at the Williams family. Her eyes filled with sorrow, but she couldn't bring herself to meet their gaze. "I know I was wrong. I just wanted things to be resolved." But those words, though belated, were like a closing bell on any hope Lexi might have had. Sarah looked at Lexi. Her eyes no longer held anger, just disappointment. "You didn't just wrong us," Sarah said clearly. "You wronged everyone on this plane who witnessed what you did." She looked Lexi straight in the eye, refusing to accept the apology that, to her, felt hollow. "We don't need your apology. What we need is justice." Once again, silence swallowed the cabin. Only the quiet sighs of nearby passengers broke the stillness. Everyone understood now. This wasn't just a simple mistake. It was something far more serious. Mistrust, discrimination, and false assumptions had affected not only the Williams family, but every soul aboard this flight. Lexi finally turned away, walking back in silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just because of the consequences she would surely face after this flight, but because of what she had done. What she felt now wasn't fear for her job. It was the painful realization of how deeply she had wronged innocent people over a baseless misunderstanding. The first-class cabin remained quiet. Only glances were exchanged, looks filled with unease and quiet reflection. Though no one spoke aloud, everyone knew. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The tension hadn't faded. It had only grown stronger. This story isn't over. And the consequences Lexi will face will become a lasting lesson for herself and for everyone who witnessed what happened. Will the Williams family be able to maintain their composure in the face of such humiliation? Will Lexi truly be held accountable for her actions? This story still has a long way to go, and it's far from over. After that tense moment, the first-class cabin seemed to be soothed by a silence that felt almost endless. Passengers slowly began to return to their activities, though no one could truly take their attention off the Williams family. The tension and emotional wounds still lingered in the air. From whispers exchanged between travelers to the subtle, lingering glances cast toward them, it was clear something had permanently changed. Marcus remained seated, staring blankly out the window, feeling like he no longer had the strength to go on. The image of his family who had boarded this flight believing they would be treated like any other passenger now felt shattered. He couldn't come to terms with what had just happened, but deep inside, He knew something had to be done. We won't let this slide, Marcus thought. An apology was not enough. This couldn't simply be forgotten. It had to be brought into the light. Sarah said nothing, but her eyes spoke volumes. She had seen it all, and there was no doubt left in her mind. This hadn't been an accident, or a simple mishap. It was latent racism, a wrongful judgment made by someone entrusted with the power to protect and serve. While Sarah never wanted to escalate things unnecessarily, she also knew their family couldn't remain silent. This wasn't just about them. It was about the many other families who could face similar discrimination on future flights. She turned to Marcus, her eyes burning with resolve. "We're going to do what's right, aren't we?" she asked, though she already knew his answer. At that moment, the cabin seemed to settle. Passengers returned to their devices or conversations, but no one forgot what had just happened. Murmurs began to ripple through the rows, about injustice, about the weight of what they had witnessed. Some offered quiet words of comfort to the Williams family, though not all looks were kind. Some eyes still held judgment and skepticism. Others whispered that Lexi's behavior was inexcusable, while a few simply shook their heads and retreated into their own lives. In contrast to the lingering tension, Lexi, after leaving the cabin, felt only emptiness. She sat alone in the crew's private quarters, the wallet still in her trembling hands. She felt as though she were sinking into a dark void, and nothing could pull her out. She stared at the wallet, haunted by the image of the Williams family. Everything she had done and failed to do now loomed over her like a shadow. Every second that passed brought deeper regret, and yet Lexi had no choice now but to face the consequences of her actions. Less than an hour later, Marcus and Sarah made a decision. They would not let this incident pass quietly. After their son had finally calmed down and fallen asleep in his mother's arms, the two sat together and composed an email to the airline's flight operations manager, requesting an immediate meeting. They wouldn't settle for vague apologies or empty promises. They demanded a full investigation into Lexi's actions, and more importantly, they demanded change. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every passenger who could suffer the same fate. "We need to make them understand this behavior is unacceptable," Marcus said firmly, his tone filled with determination. "If nothing changes, this will keep happening." Sarah agreed, her fingers tapping firmly on the keyboard, each word carrying fierce intent. They didn't want to complicate things, but she knew, without speaking up, these mistakes would never be corrected. "We have to stand on principle," she said. "We can't let this go." As they hit send, the atmosphere in the cabin remained heavy and unusual. Some passengers exchanged furtive glances. A few seemed to feel genuine sympathy for the Williams family. Their eyes reflected a shared disappointment in what had occurred, and perhaps a realization that it was time to rethink how we treat one another. A man from the back of the cabin stood and approached the Williams family. "We stand with you," he said gently, but with sincerity. "Sometimes people don't see things the way we do, but at the very least, the truth must be spoken." As for Lexi, she could no longer avoid asking herself, had she done the right thing? She sat still, the wallet clutched tightly in her hand, feeling the weight of what had just happened more profoundly than ever before. She couldn't escape the truth. She had hurt an innocent family. She had forced them to endure humiliation and injustice they never deserved. The investigation would begin as soon as the flight landed, but for the Williams family, this wouldn't be resolved with just one short conversation. They needed real change. They needed to prove that fairness and respect are not abstract ideals. A greater battle had just begun, a fight for justice, because this wasn't just about a misunderstanding on one flight. It was about how we see and treat each other. Although the tension in the airplane cabin had momentarily settled after the incident, it still lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. The story of the Williams family had begun to spread, and the attention it garnered was no longer confined to the passengers on board. It had reached others, people who would do everything they could to ensure that mistakes like this would never happen again. After the plane landed, Marcus and Sarah could no longer endure the silence. As soon as they stepped off the plane, they realized that their family was not alone. Other passengers, too, had experienced the underlying racial bias embedded in society. Vague apologies could not fix this problem. What they felt wasn't just personal injustice. It was a symptom of a larger, systemic failure they could not ignore. "We have to make sure this doesn't end with a few sorry words," Marcus said firmly. "If we don't act now, this will be nothing more than a minor lesson for this airline, and there will be no change." And so, in a quiet, tense space, they met with the airline's representatives. Two well-dressed men approached the Williams family as they entered the lounge. A suffocating atmosphere filled the room as both sides understood that this meeting was not simply about offering an apology. This was a confrontation over justice, fairness, and above all, human rights. "We're very sorry about what happened," the first representative began, his voice uneasy. "We've received a report from lead flight attendant Lexi and will conduct an internal investigation." "An investigation?" Marcus repeated, his voice sharp. "An investigation can't undo what happened. This isn't a minor incident. It's racial discrimination. A serious wrongdoing you allowed to unfold publicly in front of dozens of other passengers." He paused, trying to contain his emotions, but the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. Sarah stood beside her husband, firm like a shield. "We're not here for vague apologies or a vague investigation. We want change. We need assurance that no one else will go through what we endured. Lexi's actions damaged our dignity, and that cannot simply be brushed aside." The second representative, a younger man, nodded in sympathy, but couldn't hide a trace of discomfort. "We completely understand your frustration, but the airline cannot and will not tolerate such behavior again. We're reviewing our entire employee training program, including protocols related to discrimination and customer service." "Customer service?" Sarah cut in. "This wasn't about service, it was discrimination. It was an unacceptable act. She publicly accused us without evidence, and when she realized she was wrong, she never offered a proper apology." "We agree with you," the second representative said, his expression growing tense. "Lexi has been suspended while the investigation proceeds. We've also begun drafting a retraining plan for all our flight attendants." "Then what exactly will you do to ensure this never happens again?" Marcus asked, his voice now colder and sharper. "This entire industry needs to recognize that such behavior is unacceptable. We demand that you revise your internal procedures and change how your staff perceives passengers. We want concrete action to prevent this." But the real concern wasn't whether they agreed with the Williams family or not. The problem was the airline's lack of decisiveness. While their words sounded promising, their actions didn't yet carry the weight to prove they were serious about change. "So, are you accepting responsibility?" Sarah pressed, her voice growing firmer. "We won't let this end without clear and actionable steps. That's why we've already contacted consumer rights organizations and aviation regulatory bodies. They will help us ensure that this doesn't get swept under the rug." Those words hit the airline representatives like a punch to the face. In that moment, they realized this wasn't just about one family or one flight attendant. This was a much larger issue, one that involved justice, respect, and the rights of all passengers. Without real reform, this wouldn't just impact them. It would affect millions. The biggest question now was, would the airline truly face the truth and take action? The answer would only come through the internal investigation and the airline's response. But for the Williams family, the most important thing was this. They had done the right thing. They had refused to let injustice pass in silence, and they would not stop fighting for justice, not just for themselves, but for everyone who could be subjected to the same discrimination and wrongful judgment. Everything seemed to be reaching a boiling point. After a series of tense meetings with the airline representatives, the Williams family refused to back down. They knew that if they let the incident fade into silence, all the pain and humiliation they had endured would have been for nothing. They were preparing for a larger battle, not just against one misguided flight attendant, but against the system that allowed such irrational discrimination to exist in the first place. At home, Marcus and Sarah sat together, planning their next steps. The following day, after receiving several emails from consumer rights organizations and influential figures in the aviation industry, the Williams family decided they would no longer remain silent. They would not accept vague apologies or hollow promises. "We need to show the world that this kind of discrimination is unacceptable," Marcus said, his voice firm and resolute. "This isn't just about defending our family's dignity. It's about justice for every other passenger." Sarah nodded, her eyes full of determination. "We're not going to let them brush this off. If the airline refuses to change, we'll make sure they hear us, even if that means going to court. This is too important." The next step was filing a formal legal complaint. The Williams family didn't just submit a generic grievance. They demanded a full investigation into the airline's hiring and training practices, specifically in how racial bias and unprofessional conduct among flight staff were identified and handled. They also called on the airline to publicly disclose its reform measures and commit to a timeline for implementing them. Just days later, a shocking announcement went public. No one expected the Williams family's story to spread so quickly, but a passenger's video capturing Lexi's confrontation with the family and the events that followed went viral on social media. Viewers were outraged. Thousands of voices began to rise, demanding accountability. Public backlash against the airline grew rapidly, and consumer rights groups intensified their pressure on the company. Lexi, having already been suspended, was no longer the confident professional she once prided herself on being. She sat alone in her small apartment, her computer screen flooded with news headlines and angry online comments. Criticism came in waves. "She needs to face consequences," one comment read. "How could she treat that family like that?" Regret overwhelmed Lexi, but it did little to soothe the harm she had caused. The first call Lexi received wasn't an apology, it was a warning. The airline summoned her to a formal meeting. She was informed that her suspension would remain in place until the investigation concluded. Though Lexi knew it was only a temporary punishment, she couldn't shake the blow it dealt to her career and reputation. She couldn't forget what had happened, the loss, the shame, the personal failure. Meanwhile, the Williams family was no longer just a silent group of victims. They had become the face of a larger movement, a battle not just for their justice, but to transform a broken system. They received overwhelming support from the public, from fellow passengers on the flight, and people appalled by the airline's handling of the incident. Calls for reform echoed across platforms, and public figures began speaking out, demanding systemic change in how airlines treat their customers. 1 week later, the airline officially released the findings of its investigation. In a public statement, they acknowledged that Lexi's actions were wrong and unacceptable. But more than that, they committed to overhauling their training protocols, especially in how to identify and prevent racial bias and other forms of misconduct. They admitted it was a major failure to uphold the ethical and professional standards the company claimed to value. Yet the Williams family knew that recognition alone was not enough. They demanded clear actions and a concrete reform plan. They insisted that not only should Lexi be held accountable, but the entire system needed to change so that situations like theirs would never happen again. And so they decided to keep pushing forward. not just for justice in their case, but for everyone who had suffered from discrimination within the airline industry. Lexi, though suspended, finally understood that her regret and apology alone could not undo the pain she had inflicted. She began writing a letter to the Williams family, not as a flight attendant, but as a human being seeking forgiveness and taking responsibility. She knew she could not save her career, but she hoped that a sincere apology might offer even a small amount of healing for the damage she had caused. And so, this battle was no longer just about justice for the Williams family. It became about changing a system. It became about redefining how we treat one another on the most ordinary of journeys. This was not just one family's fight. It was a fight to open the door to fairness and dignity for everyone. This story isn't over, and one thing is certain. The actions of the Williams family have already marked a turning point, not just for one airline, but for how we understand justice in our everyday lives. The story had gone far beyond what the Williams family could have imagined. After days of tension, countless meetings with airline representatives and letters of complaint sent out, they were no longer passive victims. They had risen, not just to defend their dignity, but to fight for something greater: justice and equality for all who have been and continue to be discriminated against or mistreated in the aviation industry. This fight would not stop at a complaint form or a meeting with company officials. It was evolving into a full-scale campaign for lasting change. 1 month after the incident on the flight, the airline's official investigation was concluded. The airline announced that the results would be made public at a press conference attended by consumer protection organizations and media outlets. The Williams family was invited to attend the event, and they knew this was a major opportunity to speak the truth and ensure real change would follow. What they had endured could not end with vague apologies or empty promises. They demanded concrete, actionable outcomes. On that day, in a large corporate conference room, the tension was palpable. The media were present in full force. Regulatory bodies overseeing the airline industry were in attendance. The room felt heavy, as if everyone knew that important decisions were about to be made. A representative from the airline began by admitting that Lexi's actions had been completely wrong and unacceptable. The airline also committed to a series of reforms to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. One of the key measures included launching a mandatory retraining program for all flight attendants, with a focus on identifying racial bias and responding appropriately in all scenarios. But the Williams family would not be swayed by promises alone. Marcus and Sarah each stood to present their stance. They didn't just want commitments. They wanted a clear, detailed plan outlining how and when these reforms would be implemented. They demanded that the airline establish an oversight mechanism to monitor the progress of these changes. Most importantly, they insisted on full transparency in disclosing the results of the investigation. What we're asking for is not just an apology, Marcus said firmly. We're asking for fundamental change that ensures no one, no family, will ever have to experience what we went through. This is the moment for you to prove that you are serious about addressing this. Sarah followed, her voice calm but resolute. We're not just asking for fairness for ourselves, but for all future passengers who may face discrimination in this industry. They may not have the opportunity to speak out, but we will be their voice. We will not let this be forgotten. The strength and composure of the Williams family left a powerful impression on everyone in the room. Even the airline representatives could no longer deny that this was an issue requiring urgent, systemic change. The Williams story had become a symbol of the need for reform in the airline industry. And in that pivotal moment, everyone present understood. Change could not be delayed any longer. Then a seasoned journalist in the room stood and posed a critical question. We've heard that the airline has committed to reforms, but the real question is, Will those changes be strong enough to make a real difference? Are we truly capable of ensuring that incidents of racial discrimination like this will never happen again? Marcus responded with certainty. We can't and won't stop pushing until meaningful changes are made. This isn't just for us, it's for every person affected by unjust discrimination in society. The meeting concluded, and although certain commitments had been made, it was clear that the real challenges still lay ahead. The Williams family had begun a fight, not just for their justice, but for the principles of fairness and respect across society. And in that moment, they understood something profound. Even though difficulties lay ahead, they had done something meaningful. They had helped push forward a crucial step in changing how the airline industry and society at large perceives and treats people. Although the official results of the investigation had yet to be released, the Williams family already knew one thing for sure. They had done the right thing. They hadn't remained silent. They had stood up. And in this fight, they would not stop, not until every person, every family could trust that they would be treated fairly, without discrimination, and with dignity. After the tense meeting with the airline, the Williams family didn't feel relieved. Even though the company had pledged to implement reforms and update its procedures, Marcus and Sarah knew that real change doesn't come from vague promises. They had overcome a significant challenge, but the fight was far from over. Now they faced a more critical question than ever before. Would the airline take real action, or would it quietly retreat behind public relations gestures? The next day, as the Williams family discussed their next steps, they received an unexpected call. On the other end of the line was a lawyer representing the airline. We'd like to inform you that the company has decided to implement an immediate and comprehensive reform program. The voice was calm, but the seriousness in his tone was unmistakable. We would also like to invite the Williams family to an official dialogue with senior leadership to discuss the next phase. Marcus accepted the invitation without hesitation, though a knot of concern grew in his chest. He knew this wasn't just a chance to negotiate an agreement. It might be the airline's final opportunity to do what was right. We can't stop now, Marcus said with resolve. We have to make sure these changes happen. The day of the meeting arrived. The official session between the Williams family and the airline's top executives took place at the airline's headquarters. The tension hadn't subsided. It seemed heavier than ever as Marcus, Sarah, and the corporate representatives sat across from each other in a polished boardroom. The airline's representatives were serious. There were no casual smiles or dismissive tones. But in their eyes, Marcus and Sarah could still see anxiety, the pressure from public backlash and scrutiny from consumer advocacy groups. One of the senior executives began to speak. We understand that this incident caused significant harm to the Williams family, and we are deeply sorry for what happened, he said, placing both hands on the table. His expression was somber. However, we are committed to implementing a comprehensive reform of our hiring and training procedures to ensure this never happens again. But Marcus wasn't easily convinced. A commitment is one thing, but we need to see action, he countered. Your company may promise reform, but we want clear, transparent steps. You must demonstrate that your employees, including flight attendants like Lexi, will be held accountable. Otherwise, this conversation means nothing. Sarah followed up, her tone calm but resolute. We're not just asking for policy changes, we're asking for a shift in behavior and mindset among those working in aviation. No one should be discriminated against because of their skin color, ethnicity, or for any other reason. Show us that you're not just hearing criticism, but that you understand the issue and are ready to change. Another executive, who had been listening attentively, looked at Marcus and Sarah with a serious expression. We understand and respect your demands, he said. That's why we've decided not only to update our training programs, but also to implement an independent monitoring system to ensure these reforms are being carried out. We will provide regular reports to consumer advocacy groups to ensure no discriminatory action is allowed to occur again. The change the Williams family wanted was not theoretical. They didn't just want promises, they wanted a clear, measurable plan and continuous oversight. They wanted to make sure that what had happened to them would not happen to anyone else again. After a long meeting, the airline made its final pledge. We will accelerate retraining, revise our hiring policies, and install a monitoring system to ensure these reforms are properly executed, one of the senior executives affirmed. But the most important change had occurred within the Williams family itself. They were no longer just victims in this story. They had become leaders in a fight for justice and systemic change, not just for themselves, but for every passenger who had ever been harmed by discrimination. As the meeting ended, they walked out of the airline's headquarters with a strange but powerful feeling. They had not only reclaimed their dignity, but had compelled the airline industry to look critically at how it had treated its customers for years. And yet Marcus and Sarah knew this wasn't the end. It was a major step forward, but they also knew they would continue to fight for a more just society, for families like theirs, and for a future where no one is made to feel less because they are different. And the story of the Williams family once again became a milestone for irreversible change. They had won, not just a personal victory, but a moral one, because they stood up for justice, and for all those who couldn't speak for themselves. The story of the Williams family did not end with tense meetings, formal complaints, or public promises from an airline. They created a turning point, not just for themselves, but for the entire airline industry, and perhaps even for society as a whole. What began as a misunderstanding, a single mistake from a flight attendant, had transformed into a powerful fight for justice and social change. And the Williams family had won, not only because they reclaimed their dignity and rights, but because they helped open a new path for others to follow. As things gradually settled down, the Williams family returned to their normal life, but what they had been through would never be forgotten. Even after the airline's promises were made public, Marcus and Sarah didn't stop monitoring the progress. They continued requesting regular reports on the investigation's outcomes, holding the airline accountable to the reforms it had committed to. With each small step forward, they saw real progress unfolding. The retraining programs for flight attendants had been implemented. Staff were now trained to recognize and properly handle racially charged situations. The airline had also introduced an independent oversight system to track the progress of these reforms. Reports from consumer advocacy organizations confirmed that the airline was making genuine efforts to change. For the Williams family, they knew this was only the beginning of a long journey. But they had already achieved something they once never dared to dream, justice not just for themselves, but for all passengers who had suffered from discrimination and injustice in the aviation industry. 1 year after the incident, they received an invitation from a major consumer rights organization to speak at a national conference on fairness in aviation. Marcus and Sarah stood with pride, not just because they had defended themselves, but because they had helped shed light on a deeper issue. They realized that while the journey had been difficult, every step they had taken mattered. As they stood on stage sharing their story and the lessons they had learned, they knew they weren't just speaking for themselves, they were speaking for all those who couldn't speak up. In the end, change didn't come from investigations or vague apologies. Change came from the determination of the Williams family, from their refusal to give up. They helped push back against prejudice and, more importantly, they set a precedent, a living example of how the actions of one family can transform an entire industry and inspire others who are ready to rise and fight for justice. At the close of this story, the Williams family was no longer just victims of injustice. They had become heroes, not because they won a personal battle, but because they brought the values of justice and fairness to life. They proved that even in the face of discrimination and adversity, with enough persistence and courage, we can all change the world around us. Though this battle may be over, the journey of the Williams family will forever remain a source of inspiration. Their lives have returned to normal, but they will always remember that in the darkest moments when change seemed impossible, it was courage and conviction that led the way. They didn't just reclaim their dignity, they changed the system. And that, above all, is what they are most proud of. The story of the Williams family doesn't end here. It will live on in conversations, in community forums, and in the actions of those who were inspired by them. And as long as stories like theirs are told, we will be reminded that even the smallest act can change the world, if we're brave enough to stand up and speak the truth. Thank you for following this story. If it moved you, please like, share, and leave your thoughts below. Let's continue the fight for justice and fairness, because that's something every one of us deserves. Story message and real-life lessons learned. The story of the Williams family is not just a personal battle. It is a powerful testament to the importance of justice and fairness in our society. It is a story of perseverance, of how one family stood up to racial discrimination and injustice, not only for their rights, but to push toward a more equitable world. 1. The power of perseverance and courage. The Williams family did not allow injustice to pass unnoticed. Even though they were met with shame and baseless accusations, they never stopped fighting for what was right. Their story reminds us that sometimes the biggest changes begin with small, determined actions. No matter how difficult the journey, with persistence, we can make a difference. 2. An apology isn't enough. Action is required. Though the airline offered an apology and promised reforms, the Williams family didn't settle for vague words. They demanded clear, accountable, and transparent actions. The lesson here is clear. Empty words aren't enough. Real justice requires concrete steps, honest effort, and ongoing follow-through to ensure change happens. 3. Stand up for justice, especially for those who can't speak for themselves. This isn't just the Williams family story. It's a call to all of us. Those who face injustice are not always in a position to speak out. But when those of us with the power and platform choose to stand with them, we help build a more just and compassionate world. The Williams family didn't stop fighting, not only for themselves, but for everyone who might one day face a similar injustice. 4. Don't let racism and injustice continue unchallenged. Ultimately, the greatest lesson is that we must not allow racism or wrongdoing to go unchallenged. The Williams family story sparked a shift in how the aviation industry and society acknowledges and responds to discrimination. It's a reminder that change only happens when we confront problems head-on and commit to real, lasting solutions. Conclusion. The Williams family story is a lesson in justice, courage, and standing up for what is right. It teaches us that no matter the prejudice or injustice we may face, if we rise and act, we can change the world. Only through perseverance, bravery, and determination can we overcome challenges and build a society that's truly fair for everyone.